Imagine this. You're a battle-hardened gladiator. You've survived brutal arenas, savage mobs, and blood-soaked sand. But now you've been summoned for a private match, not to fight for your life, but to die on command. Your opponent, Emperor Commodus himself. Draped in lion skins, gripping a gilded club, eyes wide with delusion. He believes he's Hercules reborn, and here's the nightmare you're not allowed to fight back. One swing, and you must drop dead. If you resist, your entire family suffers. This wasn't theater. It was Rome's most powerful man killing for sport, laughing as warriors faked death to preserve a shred of honor. Or worse, were butchered anyway when the act didn't satisfy him. He didn't just rule Rome. He turned it into his personal blood cult. And the most terrifying part, this madness wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. He was born into a world of unimaginable power, wealth, and privilege, the son of a philosopher-king who ruled the greatest empire on earth. His name was Marcus Aurelius Commodus, and from the moment he could walk, he was told that he was special, chosen, destined. But no one could have predicted just how far those beliefs would take him, or how many would bleed for them. Marcus Aurelius, the emperor who wrote Stoic meditations in the quiet between wars, saw Rome as a place of order, duty, and restraint. He spent his life trying to bring reason to the chaos of empire. His son Commodus rejected all of it. Where Marcus lived in tents with soldiers, Commodus bathed in rose water and demanded silk pillows scented with saffron. Where Marcus read books, Commodus watched men and animals torn apart for fun. Even as a child there were signs. He liked to watch slaves punished for small mistakes lingering in the room, just a little too long as their screams echoed down marble halls. He took pleasure in mutilating small animals, then pretending to cry over their corpses like a boy playing God. Servants learned to fear him. His tutors whispered of his temper, his cruelty, and the strange, disturbing way he stared at statues of Hercules for hours, touching their muscles, murmuring under his breath. He didn't want to be like his father, he wanted to be more than a man. As he grew older, that fantasy hardened into delusion. Surrounded by flatterers and opportunists, Commodus began to believe that he was not just descended from the gods, but was a god himself. He didn't just admire Hercules, he believed he was Hercules reborn. He began training with swords and clubs, mimicking the labors of the mythical hero. He commissioned art depicting himself strangling lions, crushing serpents, and towering over dead enemies. His muscle-bound busts began to appear in temples, replacing the faces of older, forgotten gods. But Commodus wasn't content with statues. He wanted worship. He began appearing in public draped in lion skins, wielding a golden club and demanding that the people of Rome bow. Not to the emperor, not to a Caesar, but to Hercules Romanus, the divine conqueror. He declared that he was the physical embodiment of strength and virtue ordained by the heavens to rule not just the empire, but the earth itself. And he wanted proof. So he began demanding death. He ordered dozens, then hundreds of gladiators to perform in private arenas choreographed blood ballets designed to flatter his ego. Commodus always played the hero, the god, the killer. The others, they were props, victims. Living sacrifices for a man who saw himself as immortal. The rule was simple, no one could touch him. If a fighter so much as scratched the emperor, his family would suffer unimaginably. If they failed to die convincingly on cue, they were dragged away and butchered in the dark. And Commodus watched it all with joy. The empire began to shift under his madness. Senators were forced to stand and cheer as the emperor played Hercules, slaughtering crippled veterans in staged fights. He laughed as men pretended to collapse under his blows, then kicked their bodies like fallen prey. He didn't need politics. He didn't need philosophy. He needed an audience. What Marcus Aurelius built with wisdom and restraint, Commodus shattered with delusion and cruelty. Rome was no longer a republic, no longer a nation. It was a stage, a nightmare theater where every citizen, every senator, every slave was a character in his story. And Commodus, he was the god at its center, demanding blood, demanding worship, demanding silence. The monster had taken the throne and it wanted to play. The Colosseum had always been a place of spectacle, of controlled violence, of ritualized death. But under Commodus it became something far darker, a shrine to a living god's vanity. Where previous emperors had used the games to appease the people, Commodus used them to exalt himself. And the price of his ego was paid in rivers of blood. He didn't sit in the imperial box like his predecessors. He stood in the arena itself, gripping a club or a curved sword dressed in lion skins or silk. A spotlight not just on the ruler of Rome, but on Commodus, the divine executioner. He fought not for survival, not even for honor, but for applause. And he made sure it was always loud, because the games weren't real. His opponents were often wounded veterans, prisoners with missing limbs, or slaves too terrified to resist. They were forced into the arena to play their part, sometimes dressed as mythical beasts or villains, sometimes stripped naked and painted. They weren't combatants. They were actors in a snuff play, written by an emperor who thought he was Zeus's chosen son. And yet, they still died. The people were told to cheer. Soldiers handed out coins, food, and gifts to ensure enthusiasm. But underneath the roar, a suffocating tension gripped the crowd. Everyone knew what was at stake. One wrong reaction, one look of disgust, one whispered joke, one yawn could be interpreted as treason. The emperor watched the audience as closely as he watched his victims. One witness, the historian Cassius Dio, was forced to attend dozens of these events. He later wrote with careful words and trembling restraint that Commodus once decapitated an ostrich, then carried its severed head to the senators and silently gestured with his sword, implying that they were next. The message was clear: their lives, like the ostriches, could be taken on a whim. He slaughtered animals by the thousands: lions, leopards, elephants, giraffes. But these weren't hunts, these were massacres. The animals were chained, crippled, or trapped behind walls, unable to flee. Commodus would enter the arena with a bow or javelin and kill them from a distance, often laughing as they twitched and bled. He was reenacting the myths of Hercules, the Nemean lion, the Erymanthian boar, the Stymphalian birds. But the monsters he faced were real and defenseless. Some claimed he killed 100 lions in a single day. Others whispered about the time he ordered rare beasts imported from across the empire just to stab them to death in front of a cheering mob. For every staged victory, Commodus declared another divine title for himself: Slayer of Beasts, Savior of Rome, Lord of the Arena. It wasn't enough for Commodus to win. He had to be adored. To ensure this, he began charging Rome itself for his performances. Colossal sums were funneled from the treasury to stage the spectacles, paying for animals, props, elaborate sets, and of course the bribes to keep the audience cheering. When funds ran low, taxes were raised. Senators were pressured to donate gifts. Grain supplies were diverted. The empire's resources were consumed by one man's fantasy. And still the performances grew more grotesque. Commodus once entered the arena with a group of men tied together, each blindfolded and trembling. He killed them one by one, slowly, methodically pausing between each strike to soak in the applause. Some say he made them crawl toward him. Others claim he forced them to sing before he struck. Truth and legend blur, but the horror remains. For the gladiators, it was a nightmare beyond comprehension. They were trained to fight to survive, to earn honor through combat. But with Commodus, there was no glory, only humiliation. To die was a mercy. To live meant performing your own death night after night, hoping the emperor's gaze moved past you. Those who pleased him were granted gifts or spared for another show. Those who disappointed were dismembered on the sand. The Colosseum, once a symbol of Roman might, became a theater of degradation. And yet, no one could stop him. Senators watched in silence. Generals averted their eyes. Even the gods seemed absent. Rome's most sacred space was now a slaughterhouse ruled by a delusional narcissist, a man who bathed in blood and called it praise. Commodus didn't want to rule Rome. He wanted to be its main attraction. And in the arena, beneath the roar of coerced cheers and the stink of blood, the people of Rome witnessed something they could never unsee: an emperor transformed into a monster, one who smiled as he killed, not because he had to, but because he liked it. By the time Commodus had fully embraced his identity as a god of the arena, the gladiators of Rome understood one chilling truth. Stepping into the Colosseum no longer meant a chance at glory. It meant surrendering your soul to a sadistic performance where death was demanded and survival was punished. They called him Dominus Noster Hercules Invictus, our Lord Hercules the Unconquered. Not because they believed it, but because they had to. The gladiators were no longer fighters. They were disposable characters in Commodus's self-written myth. Trained from birth to wield sword spears and shields, they now practiced how to fall gracefully to a swing that might barely touch them. Commodus didn't want real combat. He wanted worship through pretend death, and for that every drop of sweat, blood, and pride had to be sacrificed. The worst part, they weren't allowed to resist. The rules were clear. When the emperor entered the arena, no blow could ever land upon his body. To touch him even by accident was to sign your own death warrant, often along with the lives of your family. Even flinching at the wrong moment could be seen as defiance. Gladiators were told to react as if stricken by divine force, collapsing in exaggerated pain, gasping, writhing, then stillness. But some failed to make it convincing enough. One man, a Thracian veteran who had fought for over a decade, reportedly hesitated a second too long before falling. Commodus halted the fight, stared at him, and without a word drove his sword into the man's chest. Then, smiling, he turned to the crowd and asked, "Did I strike true?" Another time, a group of condemned criminals was dressed in animal skins and told to act as mythical beasts. Chained and helpless, they were released into the arena, only to be butchered in a staged hunt. Commodus killed them with arrows, sometimes from behind walls where they couldn't even see him, and the crowd, bound by fear and protocol, cheered, as if watching gods at play, knowing full well that behind every laugh a scream waited. It became a theater of the absurd. Every gesture was rehearsed, every battle was a lie. Yet the pain was real. The dying was real, and the terror that was the most real of all. Imagine being one of those gladiators, knowing your fate was already sealed, knowing your survival depended not on skill or strength, but on how convincingly you could die. The arena sand soaked up not only blood, but humiliation and ancient ritual, desecrated by one man's unrelenting hunger for dominance. There was no escape. Commodus was obsessed. He didn't just fight occasionally, he made himself the star of hundreds of matches a year. Some sources say as many as 735. Almost every day, sometimes multiple times a day, he stepped into the arena in elaborate costumes. One day Hercules, the next Mercury or Jupiter, always with fresh victims and fresh delusions. The audience too was trapped in this grotesque theater. The Colosseum no longer echoed with genuine cheers or gasps. Instead, it vibrated with forced adoration. Guards roamed the stands watching for anyone who failed to clap, failed to stand, failed to scream the emperor's praises. Those who hesitated were pulled from their seats and never seen again. Applause became a survival mechanism. Even the senators Rome's highest elite were degraded. Forced to attend every game, they watched their emperor cosplay as a god smeared in gold dust, painted with animal blood prancing around the sand as if it were Mount Olympus. One senator, according to Cassius Dio, nearly choked from holding in laughter, but his wife gripped his hand with such force it left bruises. That's how close death was. Commodus didn't just demand their respect. He wanted their awe, and for the gladiators that meant living under the constant gaze of a predator who could kill at any moment and do so smiling. Behind the marble walls of the Colosseum and the underground hypogeum tunnels, where fighters waited for their turn, silence reigned. Gone were the old chants of courage, the ritual salutes, replaced by dread, by prayers for a clean death, by whispered rumors of who the emperor would play, kill next, and whether the gods would be merciful and let the act end quickly. Some gladiators tried to escape. They were dragged back. Others attempted suicide. Their bodies were fed to animals in the next show. One man, it said, gouged out his own eyes so he wouldn't have to see the emperor coming. Commodus had him paraded through the streets as an example. This is what defiance looks like. The emperor claimed he brought peace to Rome, but the only peace he gave was the stillness after death. And under his rule, every gladiator in the arena, every animal, every prisoner, every senator, and every spectator knew this Commodus didn't fight for glory or courage or even vengeance. He fought to feed a hunger so bottomless, so depraved, that no amount of applause could ever satisfy it. Only more blood. And in that pit of painted sand and broken bodies, Rome forgot its honor and remembered only this fear. By now, Commodus no longer pretended to be merely an emperor. That title was too small, too human. He was Hercules, yes, but not just in costume. He was Jupiter reborn. A living god who walked among mortals and demanded they never forget it. He changed everything to reflect this divine fantasy. Months were renamed in his honor: Amazonius ex Superatorius Lucius Commodus. Rome's calendar itself bent to his ego. Even the empire's name was no longer sacred. Commodus formally declared that Rome would now be called Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. An entire civilization thousands of years old, reduced to the pet name of a delusional tyrant. Statues of previous emperors and gods were torn down or defaced. In their place rose monuments to Commodus' colossal busts of him as Hercules club in hand, lion skin draped over one shoulder and a smirk frozen in marble. Temples were rededicated to him. Priests were made to offer sacrifices not to Jupiter or Mars, but to the emperor himself. Refusing to worship him wasn't just disloyal, it was blasphemy. And blasphemy in Commodus's Rome was punishable by death. He commissioned coins bearing his divine titles, Pius Felix Invictus, Dutiful Blessed Unconquered. One set of coins showed him strangling the world serpent. Another showed him standing over the bodies of conquered nations, foot pressed against their necks. The symbolism was clear. He wasn't just emperor. He was the destroyer of monsters, the master of fate. But there was a new kind of labor Commodus invented for himself, a 13th labor that Hercules never performed. He would cleanse Rome, not of beasts or criminals, but of traitors, enemies, anyone who questioned his godhood. And with that new labor came rivers of blood. He started with the Senate. Accusations of conspiracy became daily theater. Names were whispered and soon entire families vanished. Some were crucified publicly. Others were tortured, their corpses dumped in alleyways as warnings. Commodus called it divine justice. The people called it madness, but never allowed. Even those closest to him weren't safe. Advisors, generals, childhood friends all met the same fate if they displeased him. He once had a nobleman executed for laughing during a banquet. Another was beaten to death for stepping on Commodus's shadow. To watch the emperor's moods was to play a game of survival. A smirk could mean you were favored. A scowl could mean your children wouldn't see the morning. But Commodus didn't just destroy people, he destroyed the very idea of Rome. In his eyes, there was no Senate, no republic, no gods. Only himself, the avatar of divine strength, purity, and vengeance. He wasn't trying to govern. He was rewriting myth in real time with himself at the center. His staged games became holy rituals, his murders sacrifices. Every drop of blood in the arena was a consecration to his ego. It reached such heights of insanity that Commodus began demanding the Senate refer to him in full as Lucius Aelius Aurelius, Commodus Augustus, Herculeus Romanus, ex Superatorius, Amazonius Invictus, Felix Pius. A mouthful of madness, every title a delusion, every word a wound on the empire. The city began to reflect his sickness. Murals appeared showing Commodus towering over mythical beasts. Children were taught to praise him in prayers. Coins no longer featured Mars or victory, but Commodus wrestling serpents or raising his hand in triumph like a god descending from Olympus. And then there were the skulls. The palace gardens, once lush with fountains and roses, became filled with quiet graves. Executed senators, gladiators, disgraced servants. It's said Commodus ordered some of their skulls kept bleached and placed beneath statues of himself as if to say, "This is what worship costs." Even within the palace walls, silence spread like mold. Servants moved like ghosts. Guards avoided his gaze. Marcia, his mistress, began walking the halls with eyes wide, whispering that they were all already dead, they just hadn't realized it yet. Commodus lived like a god. But gods need no counsel, no morality, no limits. And so the killings continued. Those who bowed were broken. Those who resisted were erased, and as Rome became a living monument to one man's delusion, the people no longer whispered about the emperor. They whispered about the monster wearing his face. Because this wasn't power anymore. This wasn't politics. This was worship under threat of annihilation. This was a man who believed his divinity could only be proven by drowning Rome in blood and smiling while he did it. By now, Rome wasn't ruled by laws or legions. It was ruled by terror. Commodus had wrapped the empire in a choking fog of fear where everyone from the lowliest slave to the most decorated senator moved through life with a target on their back and a prayer on their lips. Paranoia infected the capital like a plague. Every whisper could be a betrayal, every glance a possible insult. Commodus trusted no one, and his solution to distrust was brutally simple: eliminate anyone who made him uncomfortable. His court became a revolving door of flattery, suspicion, and blood. Even those closest to him weren't safe, not friends, not lovers, not family. He created lists, long, ever-changing lists of names. Some were enemies, real or imagined. Others were added just to test loyalty. Senators who once advised his father now lived in constant dread of seeing their name appear. If it did, there was no trial, no warning. Just a knock on the door in the middle of the night, and then silence. Those left behind never asked questions. Questions were dangerous. At the center of this nightmare stood Commodus, draped in lion skins and drenched in power. But he didn't govern alone. A few key figures became the enforcers of his will. Chief among them, Cleander, a former slave turned palace chamberlain who rose to become the emperor's closest confidant. And then there was Marcia, Commodus's mistress, who wielded enormous influence behind the scenes, until she too began to fear for her life. Cleander turned Rome's government into a marketplace of corruption. Every position, governor, general, magistrate, was up for sale to the highest bidder. No experience necessary, only loyalty and coin. Under his hand, Rome's once proud bureaucracy decayed into a carnival of incompetence and bribery. Grain supplies were mismanaged, water lines failed, crime soared. But no one could complain. When a riot broke out over food shortages, Commodus didn't blame Cleander, he blamed the people. Thousands were arrested, hundreds executed. The rest were starved into silence. In the emperor's eyes, every outcry was sedition, every protest a personal insult to his divinity. Executions became a daily performance, staged as warnings. Some victims were strangled in public. Others were nailed to crosses and left for days in the sun. There were beheadings, drownings, dismemberments. A favorite punishment involved skinning prisoners alive before feeding them to animals in the arena. The streets stank of death, and still Commodus demanded more. He began purging his inner circle. Men who had once dined with him vanished overnight. One general praised in the morning was dragged from his home by sunset. Another was burned alive for treasonous thoughts revealed in a dream Commodus claimed to have had. Delusion and paranoia fused into a single homicidal force. Even Marcia, once the woman he trusted most, lived in fear. She had begun to question his sanity quietly, secretly, but Commodus was watching. One evening she found her own name on the execution list. It had been written by his hand, underlined. She was no longer his lover. She was next, and she wasn't alone. The air in the palace thickened with dread. Servants flinched at every footstep. Senators avoided speaking above whispers. Gladiators crossed themselves before walking past his statue. A smile from Commodus could be a blessing or a death sentence. There was no way to know. He had become the god of terror, and his worshippers lived on borrowed time. The cult of fear reached its height when Commodus announced that he would preside over the New Year's celebrations not as emperor, but as a living god. He would appear naked, covered in gold paint, wearing only a lion's pelt, and carrying a club before the entire Roman elite. It wasn't a performance. It was a coronation of madness, and for many in Rome it was the final sign. If Commodus went through with this, Rome was truly lost, not just in body, but in soul. But the emperor didn't care. He had long stopped caring. He didn't see people anymore, only shadows to be moved, enemies to be struck down, or crowds to be awed. He believed his own myth. He believed he was eternal, invincible. But behind closed doors, behind the golden curtains of the palace, a deadly plan was forming. Because even gods can bleed. And Commodus was about to meet the one force he had never accounted for: desperation. As Commodus spun deeper into madness, Rome itself began to fracture. The empire, once the marvel of the known world, an iron machine of roads, legions, and law, was now cracking under the weight of one man's delusion. The gods he claimed to embody had abandoned him. But the citizens hadn't yet realized they had also abandoned Rome. The treasury was emptying fast. Commodus's constant spectacles, his hundreds of battles, his imported beasts, his massive bribes to buy silence all drained the empire's gold at an unsustainable pace. Cleander's corrupt administration had turned appointments into auctions. Governors of entire provinces were chosen not for competence, but for how much they paid. The result: chaos. Provinces descended into disorder. Local uprisings flared as corrupt officials extorted populations and neglected defense. Roman roads, once guarded by disciplined legions, were now plagued with bandits. Merchants were robbed, armies underfed, and still the center of the empire remained silent, because Commodus wasn't looking outward. He was too busy looking in the mirror, literally. The emperor spent hours in his chambers admiring his image, trying on new costumes for his next appearance in the arena. Every detail had to be perfect: the shine of his club, the curl of the lion mane, the precise amount of oil on his chest to gleam under the arena sun. Artists and stylists were summoned like generals. Gladiators were selected like stagehands. He would have Rome's undivided attention even as it burned. He began issuing decrees not about laws or defense, but about titles and names. Every city in the empire had to erect statues in his likeness. Every street must bear his name. He renamed the months of the year after his own epithets, reshaping time itself into a monument to his ego. Then came the gladiatorial calendar, a series of arena matches that would crown Commodus as the ultimate champion of Rome. Not once, not 10 times, but 735 times in a single year. That's how many matches he staged, fought, and won one for nearly every day, sometimes 2 or 3 in a single afternoon. Each fight was a lie. Opponents were hand-picked cripples, weaklings, or those too terrified to resist. Commodus would enter to trumpet fanfare dressed as Hercules pose for the crowd, and then butcher his victim in one strike. If the audience didn't cheer loudly enough, he'd storm into the stands and threaten them with execution. There was no escape even outside the Colosseum. Rome itself had become a twisted reflection of the arena. Everything scripted, everyone afraid, everything fake. One citizen wrote in a surviving letter, "We used to look to the emperor for justice. Now we only look to him for how many more of us must die." And the horror wasn't limited to Rome. Legions on the frontier starved of supplies, and leadership began revolting. Generals who spoke out against the madness were executed or exiled. Some deserted entirely, taking their armies with them. As distant territories fell into rebellion or foreign attack, Commodus barely noticed. His focus was on his next performance, a reenactment of Hercules defeating the Hydra using 7 slaves dressed in serpentine masks. He killed them all one by one as the crowd chanted his name under the threat of armed guards. Back in the city, the streets were falling apart. The aqueducts went dry. Food rotted in warehouses due to mismanagement and theft. Fires burned unchecked. The Forum, once the beating heart of the empire, had become a ghost market where prices soared and the poor starved. Still, Commodus announced new festivals. He planned an event where the entire city would witness his divinity, a parade through Rome, where he would ride a golden chariot pulled by exotic animals, showered with petals dressed as Jupiter himself. Citizens were ordered to attend. Priests rehearsed hymns. Guards were instructed to execute any protesters immediately. Even among his dwindling court panic grew. Those who remained did so only out of terror. Marcia, his mistress, no longer slept. Cleander, once untouchable, had been dragged from power and executed after Commodus accused him of plotting. Others waited for the inevitable turn of his attention, the moment he'd decide they too were unworthy of his perfection. Every face around him wore a mask of praise. Every word spoken was a prayer of survival. And still Commodus smiled. He believed himself invincible, untouchable, divine. But even gods fall. And with the city starving, the army crumbling, and the Senate neutered, one question began to burn like a fuse in the hearts of Rome's terrified elite. What happens if he never dies? Because at this rate, if Commodus lived even a few more years, there would be nothing left to save. The final days of Commodus felt like the quiet before a storm, a suffocating, unnatural calm that settled over the empire while everyone waited for the next horror. The man who ruled as a self-proclaimed god was preparing what he believed would be the culmination of his divine reign, a spectacle so obscene, so ludicrous that even his most loyal followers trembled at the implications. He announced that for the upcoming New Year's celebration, he would descend upon the Roman people as Jupiter incarnate. Naked, painted head to toe in gold dust, lion pelt flowing behind him club in hand, Commodus would march through the heart of the empire to the thunder of trumpets and hymns composed in his honor. He would not be clothed because gods wore no armor. He would not speak because his very presence was the message. He believed it would be the ultimate show of power. But for those who still clung to sanity within the imperial court, it was the final warning. Rome was about to be erased, entirely replaced with Commodus's psychotic fantasy. Among those closest to him, panic gave way to resolve. Marcia, his longtime mistress and once most trusted companion, had watched his descent into madness firsthand. She had tried to reason with him, tried to protect him, but now, with her name discovered on one of his execution lists scribbled in his own hand, her terror turned to fury. Commodus no longer saw her as human. She was just another enemy of the god. She wasn't alone in her desperation. Two others joined her in secret Eclectus Commodus's chamberlain, and Quintus Aemilius Latus, commander of the Praetorian Guard. These weren't idealists or heroes. They were survivors. Men who understood that if Commodus lived much longer, there would be nothing left of the empire but bones and gold paint. Together they formed a plot that would have been unthinkable even months earlier. Not exile, not arrest, assassination. On the final day of the year, December 31st, 192, A.D. Marcia slipped poison into Commodus's wine. It was subtle, slow, a dose that would cause no immediate suspicion, just fatigue and nausea. When he drank it, the first signs were promising. He grew dizzy, then ill, then vomited violently over and over. But he didn't die. The poison wasn't enough. Whether through divine arrogance or sheer bodily strength, Commodus began to recover. By nightfall, he was resting in his chambers, regaining strength. The conspirators gathered in a nearby room realized with growing dread they had failed. And Commodus would know. They had only one option left. Latus sent for a man named Narcissus, a young wrestler, strong, quiet, loyal only to his handlers. He was ushered through the dark corridors of the palace, past sleeping guards, past golden statues of the emperor in godly poses, into the private quarters of the man who believed he was immortal. What happened next was not a duel. It was not theatrical. There were no witnesses to cheer. It was by all accounts a silent strangulation. Narcissus crept into the bathing chamber where Commodus lay. Weak, groggy, but not asleep. Perhaps he opened his eyes in time to see the assassin. Perhaps he tried to speak. Perhaps he thought it was another hallucination. What we know is that within minutes, the most powerful man in the world, the self-declared god of Rome, was dead. Not on a battlefield. Not on a throne. Not in the Colosseum. In a bathtub. Naked. Gasping for breath. Choked to death like a common criminal. The empire did not weep. There was no mourning. When the death was announced, cheers erupted quietly behind closed doors. Senators returned to the forum. Soldiers lowered their weapons. Citizens exhaled a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. The statues were torn down overnight. His name scratched from walls, from temples, from the mouths of children. The golden months he had created were renamed. The city of Colonia Commodiana became Rome again. It was as though the last 12 years had been a collective nightmare, one from which the empire was finally mercifully waking. But the damage was done. The Senate declared Commodus a public enemy, a hostis of Rome. They tried to erase him from history, to burn the records, melt the statues, grind his name to dust. But the scars remained. His reign had shattered something essential in Rome: the illusion of stability, the idea that emperors were chosen by gods, guided by virtue. Commodus had proven that one man's madness could destroy an empire from the inside out and be cheered while doing it. He had turned Rome into his stage, and in the end it was the curtain that fell on him. When Commodus was gone, it was as if Rome gasped awake from a fever dream. The city scrubbed itself clean in the only way it knew how, by pretending he had never existed. His statues were pulled down and hurled into the Tiber. His name was scraped from inscriptions, erased from coins, and burned from temple records. The Senate tried to purge his memory, damnatio memoriae, the ultimate punishment to be forgotten by history. But history is not so merciful. The shadow Commodus cast didn't vanish. It deepened. His death triggered a power vacuum so profound, Rome would never fully recover. Within a year, 5 different men would claim the throne. Civil wars would follow, assassinations, riots. The empire teetered. Many historians believe Commodus's reign marked the beginning of the fall of Rome, not in battle but in soul. Philosophers wrote of him in hushed tones, calling him a sickness of the mind, a rotting god, a man who mistook death for worship. Gladiators whispered his name for generations, not out of reverence but in fear. They spoke of an emperor who fought battles where only one man could live and only one man mattered. To them, Commodus was not just a tyrant. He was the first emperor to play at godhood and believe it fully. And what's most terrifying, he wasn't alone. Throughout history, other rulers, Nero, Caligula, Ivan the Terrible, Kim Jong-il, have followed that same path. Men who demanded worship, who blurred the line between myth and reality, and who ruled not with justice but with spectacle and fear. What Commodus showed the world, what Rome learned too late, is that when a leader sees themselves as a god, everyone else becomes a sacrifice. His story is a warning, not just about madness or cruelty or power, but about how easily a crowd can be taught to cheer for blood, how terror can wear the mask of applause, and how civilization itself can become a stage when one man demands that everyone else plays dead. If this story shook you, share it. Leave a comment. What do you think was the most horrifying part of Commodus's reign? His delusions, the forced deaths, or how long it took for someone to stop him? Subscribe for more true historical nightmares, because the past is darker than you think. Until next time, stay curious, stay haunted,